All right, you should see on the back of your sheet there is somewhat of an outline. Most of the content is going to come from your answers and your listening, and so the stuff that you write in the blank is really just going to be some dividers for you. So what I'm saying by that is, if the only 4 words that you write down are the 4 words that are in the blanks, you might as well not write anything down, because you're going to take that home and all you're going to have is some questions. And you're going to think, I wonder what we talked about tonight. So those are just there to kind of guide our conversation. You'll have to take some notes along with that if you want to capture some of the good content of this particular parable. Just to remind you, we are somewhat using Eugene Peterson's book, Tell It Slant, to guide us through this time. Peterson's agenda, his strategy in this book is to take us through what he calls the travel narratives of the Gospel of Luke, which are between Luke 9, when Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, leaves Galilee and starts to head toward Jerusalem, and will eventually arrive at Holy Week, and then the events of his trial, his crucifixion, and ultimately his resurrection. So that starts in Luke 9. It culminates with his arrival in Jerusalem in Luke 19. So in the intervening chapters, there are 10 chapters there, and much of that is filled with parables and teaching. Now, Eugene Peterson focuses on 10 of those parables because they are parables that are only captured for us in the book of Luke. So we're not covering every parable that's in those 10 chapters. Tonight is a very good example of that, because actually what you'll see is he kind of cuts off somewhat in the middle of the same topic. We're going to start in verse 1. We're going to go through verse 14. And then really the story that begins in verse 15 is really the same topic, the same theme, but it is a teaching that is also covered in Matthew's Gospel. So we're going to focus on those first 14 verses. And as you can now see, because it's on the screen, he has entitled this particular section, this parable, or it's really a couple of parables kind of sandwiched together. He has called it Table Talk from Luke chapter 14. And this is what Eugene Peterson says about that table talk. He points out that Jesus taught in the synagogue and preached in the temple, but settings of hospitality seem to be Jesus' venue of choice for dealing with kingdom matters. Let me see if I can identify the paragraph in which he talks about some of that. So he points out that much of the teaching of Jesus, especially as it is captured in Luke's gospel, happens in the context of a meal. Either stories about meals or stories that are told in the midst of meals. And so I'm just going to read this paragraph to you. Sometimes Jesus is the host, feeding the 5,000, Luke chapter 9, hosting the Last Supper, Luke chapter 22. Sometimes Jesus is the guest, at dinner at Levi's house, chapter 5, twice at supper with the Pharisees, chapter 6, and the passage that we'll deal with tonight in 14. In the home of Mary and Martha, chapter 10, at the home of Zacchaeus, chapter 19, at the third resurrection appearance, chapter 24, and sometimes, as at the Emmaus Supper, you can't tell the difference between host and guest. So his point is, much of the really significant teaching that happens in Luke's gospel centers around table talk, stuff that happens around meals. So follow along in your Bible. I'm going to read Luke chapter 14. I'm going to begin in verse 1, and I'm going to read through verse 14, and then we'll ask some questions about the text. And you did an incredible job last week of giving me feedback and us really studying the Bible together. So we'll do that again tonight. Beginning in verse 1. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. Now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, Give your place to this person. And then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, Friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. He said also to the man who had invited them, When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So there is the table talk that Jesus shares with us in Luke chapter 14. So first question, what is the setting? What's the setting of this particular story? What was that? Okay, there's a table, there's a meal going on. Do we know anything else about the setting? It is a Sabbath. Okay, so that is the Lord's Day. In Jewish in the Jewish customs, Sabbath for them would have been the Saturday. The concept of Sabbath for us, at least as it is interpreted by most Christians, and I would say all Baptists, the context of Sabbath for us is Sunday. That all happens with the resurrection and the gathering on Resurrection Day and the Lord's Day. But for them, it was that period of time from Friday evening at sundown to Saturday evening at sundown. So that was a day set apart for the Lord. And there were all kinds of restrictions and regulations and rules that they had to keep for the Sabbath. Okay, so we're talking about a Sabbath day and eventually this meal that Jesus has been invited to. Simon Kistemacher, who wrote a book on the parables of Jesus, just points out that after the synagogue service on the Sabbath, Jews would eat a substantial meal to which quite often a number of guests were invited. So this is a normal thing for Jews to do as they leave the synagogue. They go and they gather together, kind of like we do. Sunday dinner. So this is their equivalent of Sunday dinner, and at this particular Sunday dinner, Jesus has been invited, and they invited him just because they wanted to spend time with him, right? Is that the impression that we get from the text? What impression do we get from the text? They're going to put him in a corner. Why do you say that, Tom? What in the text tells you that they're going to put Jesus in a corner? Okay, so they're asking him questions. What about before they start asking? Well, actually, he's asking them questions. But even before that, what clues do we have? Yeah, verse 1. Notice that last phrase in verse 1. He's in the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, and they were watching him carefully. You know, when I read that phrase, I was reminded of my days as a substitute teacher in elementary school. That's one of the ways that I paid bills in the seminary. I had 3 or 4 jobs, And one of them was a substitute teacher, and I found out very quickly that middle school and high school was much more my cup of tea, because I could tell the principal, hey, put me in a math class. I can actually teach the lesson, and I don't have to babysit. Don't put me back in elementary school. I lasted one day in elementary school. A second grader threw his book bag at me on the way out the door. One day. But one of the things I noticed when I was dealing with kids, specifically in that setting, and sometimes I'm still guilty of it in my house, is when I'm not in the right frame of mind, sometimes when there's someone who gets on my nerves, I'm looking out to them. I'm looking at them even more carefully to catch them in something that they're going to do. So this definitely rung a bell with me. They are suspicious of Jesus. They do not like what Jesus is offering, and specifically as it relates to Sabbath. Now, how do we know that? How do we know that I'm not just reading into the text? Because they're asking him questions in some other passages. Jesus is asking questions in this passage. But actually, if you just look back one chapter, and this happens throughout the Gospels and in different ways according to different Gospel writers. But if you just look back one chapter, we understand how we are going from the setting of the story to the significance of that setting. So let's talk about the significance for just a second. If we back up for a chapter, look at beginning in verse 10 of chapter 13. It says, "Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath." I don't think this is the same Sabbath, because we have some commentary later in the chapter that basically gives the idea that Luke had given us a snapshot of one Sabbath, and then Jesus is going around through the towns and villages, and he's continuing to teach. And then at the beginning of chapter 14, it says one Sabbath. So these are not the same Sabbath Sundays, but Luke is painting a picture for us of the animosity that is developing between Jesus and the religious leaders as it relates to Sabbath. He was teaching in the synagogues on one of the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a disabling spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. Now, we won't read the whole chapter, but Jesus healed her. He freed her of that. And then it says in verse 14, "But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, 'There are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, but not on the Sabbath day.'" So we start to see some of the significance of what the author is pointing to, of what Luke is pointing us to when he starts this story by saying one Sabbath. So I think one of the keys to understanding what's happening in this story is to understand there's really 3 different scenes in this chapter. In these first 14 verses that I just read, there's an implied scene. What is the first implied scene that's not actually mentioned specifically in the story, but it's implied? Where have they probably been right before they head to that Sabbath meal? Okay, they've been to synagogue. They've been to worship together. So the first implied scene is they're gathered together in the synagogue for worship. And then as we look at verse 1, one Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. In my mind, when I first read that, the natural reading, I think, is to assume now we're in the house. And we're already there, and we're sitting down at table. I don't think that is the picture that Luke is painting for us. And the reason I think we know that is because of what happens before we get to the context of the actual meal. What is the event that happens before we get to the meal proper? Okay, so there's someone there with dropsy, as it says in the text. So if you look at verse 2 again, "Behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy." If we see ourselves as already in the room, You know, if we think that verse 1 has already put Jesus in the room around the table, then this man who has dropsy would have to be one of the invited guests. That's not the picture we get from the story, is it? He's not an invited guest. So I think what's happening is they've left scene 1. Scene 1 is they're gathered over here in the synagogue and they're worshiping together. And scene 3 that we're going to end up in is in the home of the Pharisee. But what's scene 2? They're making their way. They're on the way, and maybe just before they get to the Pharisee's house, they see this man with dropsy. Now, other translations, what words do you have other than dropsy? Or what phrase do you have? Arms and legs were swollen, okay? Does anybody know what dropsy is? Okay, it could be heart failure. What I'm reading, and I think that's very true, what I'm reading is it's an ancient word for what we would call now edema, which is swollenness. You got fluid in places where fluid is not supposed to be. That's usually a heart issue because your heart is not pumping as it should be. Now, if you don't, here's just a little nugget here on Bible study. If there are details in the text that you don't understand, it's probably a good thing to try to figure out what those details are. Like if you read this story and you have no idea what dropsy is, but I think even if you have no clue what dropsy is, you can get the idea that there's a healing of some sort. So it's a physical condition. But if you actually know what it is, I think Jesus' response, his follow-up question, becomes even more significant, even more pertinent to the discussion. So dropsy is an old way of saying what we would call edema now, which is swollenness because of fluid in the joints. And so when Jesus sees this man, he asks, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Now, I think Jesus is asking that question because of what just happened in Luke 13. He healed on the Sabbath. It caused all this commotion. So now he has another teaching opportunity, and he presents it to them. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And what do they say? They don't say anything. Because maybe they're wising up a little bit to know we can't corner this guy. He's going to get us one way or the other. There's nothing I can say. So Jesus follows up with another question. He says to them, which of you having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day will not immediately pull him out? Now, what do we find in a well? We find water in a well. See, that's where I think the edema, the dropsy thing starts to make sense a little bit. Because here's this man who is suffering because of water issues, fluid issues. And Jesus asked the simple follow-up question, if your ox fell in a well, if he was in a precarious situation as it relates to water, if your son was in a precarious situation as it relates to water, would you not immediately pull him out? Or would you say, you know what, I can't do that on the Sabbath day. I'll come back and see you tomorrow. So what is their answer? Once again, nothing. I think because they know it doesn't matter how we answer that question, it's the wrong answer. If we say, yes, of course I would pull my son out, then Jesus says, well, why would we not do the same thing for this guy? And if they say, no, we wouldn't do that, then Jesus says, why in the world would you not do that? There's no compassion there. So Jesus is pulling out their hypocrisy. I don't think this teaching is primarily about edema or dropsy or about a son or an ox in the well. Jesus is simply pointing out the hypocrisy of them being angry about what he's doing on the Sabbath when he understands all along what Sabbath is really for. Remember what he said in another place, that the Sabbath was created for man and not man for the Sabbath? So the Sabbath is supposed to be for our benefit, and yet they're twisting everything around. So he tells them this parable. That brings us to the second scene in the parable. He told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor. saying to them, when you're invited by someone to a wedding feast, don't sit down in a place of honor lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. So we've read that before. So what's the problem here? What is the problem that Jesus is pointing to? And there are actually two different problems that Jesus is pointing to. See if you can pick them out in the text, remember them, and let's talk about them. What are the two problems that Jesus is pointing out? All right, so problem number one is addressed to the people who have been invited to the feast. So they come into the Sabbath meal, and there's this arrangement of seating, and there was customary seating at this Sabbath meal, and they would know which were the places of honor and which were not the places of honor. And Jesus sees them fighting over the good seats. And so the first problem is, here is this meal where we're supposed to have an extended opportunity to reflect on Sabbath and what we have experienced together in the synagogue as we worship and sit under the teaching of God's Word. And all of a sudden, almost instantly, we are fighting over who's going to get the best place. Now, I realize that this is probably completely non-pertinent to you, because I'm sure that you've never experienced any selfishness right after worship, right? In my family, we've never had an argument at the Sunday dinner table because we're fresh out of worship. You know, we're all spiritually charged up, and there's no way we would take the opportunity to be selfish. But that's exactly what Jesus is pointing out. Here you have taken what is supposed to be this very special time of hospitality, fellowship together, reflection on the Lord's goodness to us, on His provision for us, and you are fighting for what chair you're going to sit in. How silly is that? Okay, so that's problem number one. What's problem number two? Because he tells two stories, right? Doesn't tell one story, he tells two stories. What is the second problem that he points to? What was that, Debbie? Okay, he is talking about what we're doing on the Sabbath. If the first one is pointed toward the guests who have been invited, who is the second story pointing to? All right, so the second problem is not about those who have been invited. It is directed to the person who did the inviting. So now we're talking to the host. And what is basically the accusation, Tom? What accusation is Jesus making? Yeah, don't invite your brother or your neighbor or the rich guy down the street, because he's going to be able to repay you. What is the accusation that Jesus is making? He tells him instead to invite the poor, but what is the motivation that he assigns to the host at the dinner table? What is he saying he's doing? But for what reason? Why is he saying invite the poor and the hungry? Do you think, let's just stop and let me ask you a question for a moment. Do you think it is sinful to invite your neighbor or your brother or a rich person? Is it sinful to invite those people? Is Jesus pointing out you should not invite those people? This is where we have to be able to read the focus of the parable and understand that sometimes Jesus is pointing something out to make a point, and if we're not careful, we totally miss the point. No, feel free. We're about out of time, so this would be a good time to contribute. Right. So it is not who has been invited, although that is how Jesus frames the story. The issue is the motivation behind the inviting. So he's basically accusing this guy. listen, I see what you're doing. I see that you've invited this guy over here because you got a favor that you want to ask him later. And you invited this guy over here because you want to have power over him in this particular way. You want to have some influence over him. And Jesus is saying, here is the takeaway. Here is the principle here. Jesus is saying to both parties, both the one who threw the party and hosted the meal, and to those who were invited and attended the meal, he says to both of them, you have completely missed the point. And you have completely ruined the occasion. One of the things that Peterson points out is that if we're not careful, not only can we do this same kind of thing at Sunday dinner, we can do the same thing at our Sunday worship gathering. We can gather with all the right appearances and do all the right stuff and have all of the wrong motivation and thinking behind it. And Jesus would say the same thing to us. You've totally missed the point. You've totally ruined the occasion. This is not a gathering for you to have the best seat. It's not a gathering that's supposed to benefit you in terms of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, or maybe if I talk to the right person on Sunday morning or out in the main lobby, maybe my business will grow a little bit, or I'll be able to do this or that. Jesus is saying you've taken what is supposed to be special and focused on the Lord, and you're just using it to promote yourself. The guests are trying to promote themselves by getting the right seat, and the host is trying to promote himself by serving his future interests. And that's why the principle here, as we look at what is the principle, we are blessed in this particular parable that the principles are actually spelled out for us in the text. We don't have to figure out what the principles are, because here they are. Jesus gives us two different principles. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That's one principle. And the second principle comes in verse 14. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Remember the seesaw of God's law that I've taught you occasionally? I know it's been a long time since we talked about it, but y'all remember what a seesaw is, right? God's law of the seesaw is this side over here is what you do for yourself, and this side over here is what God does for you, and they're connected. So this text says if you exalt yourself, what's going to really happen over here that God's going to do? He's going to lower you. So you're trying to raise yourself, but God's law of the seesaw is you're going to be humbled. But if you understand God's law of the seesaw and you humble yourself and you come in true humility before the Lord, you don't have to worry about whether you're going to get what you think you need to get. God is going to exalt you. And sometimes it's going to be at the resurrection of the just. Sometimes our just rewards, our full rewards, are not going to come on this earth. But we have to remember that God's principles are true. And if we will humble ourselves and keep our focus on Him, and going back to our previous parable, remain in a position of dependence, recognizing that we need Him desperately. If we will maintain that position of dependence, we don't have to fight for the best seat. We don't have to fight for the way that we would prefer to have stuff. And we don't have to finagle certain relationships to make sure that we get what we think we deserve. God will take care of all of that if we stay humble before Him. So Jesus tells this powerful parable that we need to make sure that we're listening to and see how He's speaking to us through it. Okay, let's pray together.